Welcome to the sixth lecture on advanced mechanics. Today we talk about 2D elasticity. This is the first part of a two-part lecture, and in this part we're going to talk about Cartesian coordinates. Learning objectives are be able to reduce the 3D linear elasticity equations to 2D plane stress-strain equations. Last session, we solved the 3D linear elasticity equations for some simple cases, but today we're going to learn how to even more reduce the complexity of some problems by reducing the 3D geometry to 2D geometry. Second objective is derive the reduced equations in Cartesian coordinates. And finally, solving 2D plane stress-strain problems using area stress functions. So the difference between this lecture and the previous lecture is, in the previous lecture, we solved the 3D linear elasticity equations, but they're in general very complex to solve, so we could only use that 3D formulation for some very simple cases. But for more complex cases, sometimes we can simplify the geometry and bring it to 2D cases, and then deal with those complex cases easier in the 2D case. Let's see some biological examples. I'm going to start with the introduction. In a number of engineering applications, a specific body geometry and loading patterns lead to a reduced, essentially 2D form of the equation of elasticity. The study of these situations is referred to as plane elasticity. Plane stress, there is no traction on one plane passing through the body, so we have only tractions on two of the planes, and on the other one plane you don't have any traction. That's plane stress. And plane strain is there is no strain on one plane passing through the body. So in this case, we have strains, deformations, on two of the planes, but in the one remaining plane, you don't have any strain. These are two diagrams for the two cases. See, we have here a slice that describes the plane stress. Assume that's a slice from a cylindrical or a spherical body. The body forces P and the boundary forces showed here by T, the traction force, they're symmetric. So basically we can just cut a single plane out of the body and assume the only forces acting on that a small element are acting on a plane with no traction or no forces perpendicular to that plane. That's the case of plane stress. So basically plane stress, thin plate with one dimension very much smaller than the other two. So you see that the thickness is very small compared to the other two dimensions of this thin plate. And loading in the plane of the plate and assumed to be uniform across the thickness. So you see that rho and T are on the plane of this plate. There is no load perpendicular to that. And these P and T are uniform across the tiny thickness that we have there. Now the case of plane strain. See this red body. You essentially see that the green plate is basically cutted through this extruded red body, right? But sometimes we don't have that uniform loading, but we have a very long cylindrical or extruded object with kind of uniform cross-section. Not necessarily uniform, but the object, the extruded object, is a very long one. So there we can assume that there is no strain along the axis of that body, and we can assume that all of the strain that we care for are in the plane of the cross-section of that extruded element. Here we're going to talk about the concept of plane strain. So it's like a blood vessel, for example. It can be similar to urinary tract or the airway tract in your lung. Basically, any lung tissue under uniform loading that you can assume that the strain along the axis of that body or that tissue is negligible. So basically, plane strain, it's prismatic body with one dimension, very much larger than the other two. So you see that the length is very much larger than the planar dimensions, the cross-section dimensions here. Loading perpendicular to and distributed uniformly with respect to this large dimension. Again, you see the body load P and the boundary forces shown by T, the traction vector, are perpendicular to the axis of this body, and they're uniform along this body. And finally, the analysis may be focused on a thin slice of the body because conditions are the same at all cross sections. But in this case, we assume that there is no strain perpendicular to this thin plate, compared to the case of plane stress, that we had again a thin plate, but we assume that the stress is negligible or zero perpendicular to that plate. So basically, the case of plane stress, it's a thin cutted section of a body with uniform loads aligned with that plane, but there is no stress or forces perpendicular to that plane. In the case of plane strain, again we have a thin plate cutted from a longer body, again with body and body forces and boundary forces uniformly distributed along the main axis of the body, but this time we assume there is no strain perpendicular to the plane of the cutted element. Okay, so the difference is in plane stress, you don't have perpendicular stress or forces. In plane strain, you don't have perpendicular deformations or strain. Okay, here are some biomedical examples. The case of plane stress, you see that we have a cutted thin element from a body, and you see that the forces are all aligned with that plate. Okay, local stress states in curved membranes such as pericardium, urinary bladder, and saccular aneurysm. I'm going to talk about pericardium and urinary bladder here. but you may remember saccular aneurysm from the previous lecture. Okay, pericardium is actually a thin layer around heart, and sometimes it gets filled with water or fluid, basically, pushing against the heart. That can be a side effect of many diseases, but we don't care about the disease here. We just care about how to model this additional pressure due to extra fluid in pericardium. You see that we have a kind of body organ here that has an external layer, and then the heart is inside, and we have uniform pressure due to the fluid gathered inside pericardium. Here we can just slice a thin plate from the whole geometry and assume that body forces due to the weight of the fluid and bond retractions due to the pressure of the fluid are all aligned with the cut plane, and assume that there is basically no normal pressure or force normal to that cutted plane. So basically calculation of the stress and strain distribution in the case of pericardium filled with buildup fluid can be reduced to a plane stress case. Another example can be the pressure that bladder wall tissue undergoes. So the bladder itself is kind of like a sphere. When urine builds up inside the bladder, again, we to calculate the pressure and a strain, to calculate the stress and strain in bladder tissue wall, we can cut a thin slice of the geometry and assume that the body forces due to gravity, due to the weight of the urine and tissue muscles and tissue itself, and also boundary forces, again due to the pressure of urine gathered inside the bladder, they're all acting in the plane of that cutted thin plate element. And there is no extra force or pressure or stress perpendicular to that. Again, we can reduce the geometry, this 3D geometry, to a 2D plane stress case. Just pay attention that in both the pericardium and fluid buildup around heart and bladder with urine buildup inside the bladder, both of the organs are kind of spherical. And we have uniform pressure outside and uniform pressure inside. It is similar to the aneurysm, the vascular aneurysm we talked about in the last section, in the last lecture. So these spherical, kind of spherical geometries with uniform pressure inside and outside, we can reduce the geometry into 2D plane stress cases. So they have basically polar symmetry. So if we cut a plane inside, we cut a thin plate from these biological tissues or biological organs, and then we just rotate that thin plate around an axis, it regenerates the whole geometry. So they have kind of polar symmetry or axis symmetry. So basically this simplification also gives us a good way to find the mechanical properties of the tissue. So mechanical properties of these membrane usually tested using biaxial extension tests. For example, meaning that subject to orthogonal and plane loads F1 and F2 that you see here. So basically human tissue is placed at the center of the test machine. You see the machine here, that's the sample. And then biaxial forces are exerted at the tissue, and calculating the stress and strain distribution in the tissue, we can formulate the plane stress case and then generalize it to the whole biological organ or tissue. Okay, let's see some examples for the plane strain. Plane strain is like having a long duct constrained at both ends. So due to internal pressure, and the pressure and body forces are perpendicular to the axis. Due to internal pressure and body forces, you get deformation, but because of the side walls, you don't get any deformation along the axis. Well, of course, nowhere in our body we have those constraints, those walls that basically predict a long duct from axially expanding or shrinking. But if a lumen or a duct is long enough, we can assume that there is no axial strain, and we can assume we have plane strain case. That's the case of arteries, arterioles, airways if neglected pre-stretching, and central part of the left or right ventricles. Let's see some of that. Here's a heart. Just have a look at the arteries. So basically, the blood vessels are very long, tube-like structures, multi-layer, and layers of muscles around the vessels controls the expansion or shrinkage of the diameter of the blood vessel, controlling blood flow and blood pressure. Calculating the stress and strain in the blood vessels can be easily done by a plane strain assumption, because they're long and the only forces acting on those organs are the blood pressure, which is radial, which is basically perpendicular to the axis of the vessel. Another example can be long airways, and for example the case of thickening of the airways due to asthma. Again, these are long ducts. We have air pressure inside, and the air pressure is forcing the duct wall radially, so the force or the pressure is perpendicular to the axis of the duct, and since the duct is long enough, we can assume that there is no axial strain, and we can basically calculate the stress and strain distribution in these organs based on plane strain case. So again, lots of kind of spherical organs, if we neglect the pre-stretch and gravity and assume only the internal pressure, we can assume they're undergoing planar stress, because we can just basically cut a thin plate and assume the pressures are always radial and there is no pressure or a stress perpendicular to that cut plane. For a lot of long ducts or long tubes in the body, we can, neglecting pre-stretch or weight, if they undergo uniform pressure, which acts only radial, perpendicular to the duct axis, we can assume that they're undergoing plane strain. Because they're long enough, we can assume that there is no axial strain. So basically, we cut a thin plate again, we bring it to 2D, and assume that there is no perpendicular deformation or a strain there. Okay, in the next section of this lecture, we're going to see how these assumptions simplifies the geometries and solutions, and what are the implications of these assumptions.